Alright guys, how you doing? I've had to slightly change my plan for this video. It was supposed to be one video, however it is such a monster that it has grown into two, and rather than have a 40-minute episode, I've just decided to split it into two episodes. I'm just a completionist and I want to have the entire story told here. So this first one is really all about the history behind AMD's master plan, and the second video will be about the master plan itself. Hopefully you will see the second part at some point during next week. Alright guys, how's it going? Ever since I bought my very first AMD CPU, must have been 15 to 20 years ago, I can't remember the exact date now, but it was an AMD K6-2 processor, 550 megahertz I believe, so it was actually the top end one. I think these had speeds of around 200 to 550 megahertz. So yeah, it certainly goes back a little while. Up to that point I was mostly buying consoles I think, and one or two Intel CPUs as well. From this point onward I basically bought a lot of AMD stuff and a lot of Intel stuff as well. When it came to graphics cards though, I mostly bought Nvidia. So let's start by having a look at AMD and their closest competitors. When it comes to high-end gaming, there are basically three companies that matter. On the left you've got Intel, on the right you've got Nvidia, and sandwiched in between this deadly duo is AMD. If you think about it, at a basic level, companies are a collection of assets and liabilities, most of which are tangible, but some are also intangible. Everybody knows that Intel makes very fast CPUs. Their i5s, their i7s, they are the go-to CPUs for any serious gamer. Intel also has massive manufacturing capability. They control the vast majority of the CPU market, and they sell hundreds of millions of CPUs every year. If you look at Nvidia, everybody knows that Nvidia makes very fast GPUs. Not a lot of people realise that they also make CPUs, however these are not really on the same level as the x86 CPUs that Intel and AMD make. They're called Tegra. They have had some success in tablets in the past, for example Google Nexus 7 I believe, where Nvidia got the Tegra processor into that tablet and it sold pretty well. They're based on ARM Holdings RISC architecture. That's reduced instruction set computing, and there are actually quite a lot of companies making CPUs based on this now. That's what all your smartphones are based on, and that's very much the level we're talking about here. However, even in amongst this group, Tegra is sort of looked upon as being second rate. Nvidia makes better GPUs than they do CPUs, put it that way. Nvidia doesn't actually have their own manufacturing capability though. They're reliant on a company called TSMC, and they also build some chips at Samsung. So while Intel makes their own chips, Nvidia pays a foundry to do that. And like I said, sandwiched in between these two is AMD. Now AMD makes CPUs and GPUs now. They started off as a CPU company, and they actually had a lot of success in the past. And there's a lot of money to be made in CPU. The only problem is, you've got to beat Intel to do that. Given the differences in size between Intel and AMD, this is really not an easy task. As far as GPU goes, they bought a company called ATI, who were Nvidia's only competitor at the time. Now, when it comes to manufacturing, AMD are sort of in between Intel and Nvidia now. They used to be like Intel, where they owned their own fabs, but owning fabs is a very, very expensive business these days, and simply put, they ran out of money. They could no longer afford to pay the capital expenditure in order to continue to improve their process. So what they did was, they spun off their fabs, created a company called Global Foundries, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Abu Dhabi government. So now they're sort of like Nvidia, where they pay this company Global Foundries to make all of their GPUs and CPUs. They did however have to sign a rather unfavourable agreement called the WSA, the Wafer Supply Agreement, which basically ties them in to buying from Global Foundries. Now, so long as Global Foundries is performing well, that's absolutely fine. Up until recently though, they've really been underperforming, so AMD has kind of been stuck there, having to buy their wafers from this company who are underperforming. AMD also buy wafers from TSMC, the same company that Nvidia does, and next year they will also be buying from Samsung. So long as they meet their allocation from Global Foundries, which is around about $1 billion worth of wafers every year, then they can also spend elsewhere. So right now it's a disadvantage, but theoretically, if Global Foundries ever started to provide a decent process, then in effect AMD would have a lot more manufacturing capability than Nvidia would ever be able to have. This is a big advantage, as you'll soon see. So I mentioned intangible assets, and what I really mean by that is stuff like marketing. and also things like mindshare. The reason I've mentioned marketing and mindshare is that AMD is known to struggle with these things, whereas a company like Nvidia has extremely strong marketing and mindshare. By mindshare, I simply mean people just assume they are better through a combination of marketing and a bunch of other stuff that I'm going to talk about. This is a bit of a tangent here, but what this really comes down to is stuff like branding and naming. For example, Nvidia is a much cooler name than AMD. Nvidia knows how to brand things as well. You think about these. Shadowplay. That's the ability to record your gameplay and stuff on Nvidia graphics cards. What's AMD's called? Game Video Recorder. At least you know what it does? Yet on a daily basis, I see stuff like, why can't AMD record gameplay? People simply don't know, because in many ways the marketing's not quite there. GeForce or Radeon. Which one of those sounds best? Radeon was a brand of washing powder in the UK. It doesn't sound that good. Call it Radeon if you want. To us in the UK, it's Radeon. And yes, it's true that it was ATI who branded the graphics cards Radeon. However, when AMD bought out ATI, they got rid of the ATI name. They really should have got rid of the Radeon branding at the same time. But this is important, yeah, because these things stick. And like I said, that's a bit of a tangent, but Nvidia has much higher mindshare than AMD, and it's something that AMD really struggles with. They have had one or two successes, however. For example, Eyefinity. If you think about multi-monitor, you probably think Eyefinity rather than NV Surround. So this is one of the times when AMD's marketing got it right, and Eyefinity was a great technology that AMD really leveraged to their benefit. And this leads me on nicely to the next part of the video, so I'm going to talk about that now. When I first started buying PC hardware, I was really buying Nvidia cards exclusively, and I think this is a pretty common thing. It's just that mindshare thing. When you're not a real enthusiast, you're probably walking into a store like PC World and buying something off a shelf, and chances are you'd be seeing some Nvidia card on the shelf, and that's the one you would go for. That's pretty much what I was doing. After a while though, I started paying a bit more attention, reading a few articles on the internet, and I finally bought my first ATI card, which was the X1950 Pro. Very good card. This must have been about 2007, I think. Ended up buying another one, in fact, and that was my first attempt at Crossfire, a double GPU setup. After that, I went back to Nvidia with the awesome 8800 GT, very famous graphics card, and then around the middle of 2009, I read an article that was going to change the way I saw these things forever. This article was over at AnandTech. Beginnings of the holodeck, AMD's DX11 GPU, Eyefinity, and 6 display outputs. Now, apparently AMD had got Warcraft working at 7680 by 3200 resolution. In Warcraft, at over 80 frames per second, details maxed. Now, I knew that my 8800 GT was simply not capable of doing that or anywhere near it, so I became very interested in this card, and a few weeks later it launched. This was the first DX11 GPU, but it was Eyefinity that really got my attention. Now, I am not an early adopter, but in this case, I was. I wasn't interested in having 6 displays. However, you can also do it with 3. And back then, monitors were dropping in price down to just over £100, maybe what, $130, $140 or something? £220 for a 5850 graphics card. Another £100 each for 2 monitors. Under £500 for what is basically a massive upgrade and one of the best gaming systems you could get at that time. Now, I should say that Matrox also had a competing solution known as Triple Head to Go, but that required separate hardware. It wasn't just done on the graphics card. But for me, Eyefinity was a game changer, or it should have been. This was late 2009, early 2010, and AMD had released their Cypress generation of graphics cards. Top to bottom, you had your 5870 at the top, all the way down to the much weaker 5670, and all of these cards were Eyefinity capable. Now, obviously, when you're trying to power 3 screens, it's better to have a more powerful card. However, even these entry-level cards could do it at lower settings. Not only that, but the cards were much more power efficient. And you can see here that AMD was in complete control regarding performance per watt. The best performing Nvidia card, the GTX 285, was well behind. And on top of that, Nvidia was taking ages to release their newest architecture, which was known as Fermi. Now, I've talked about Fermi once or twice before without really going into it, and it's difficult to talk about Fermi without talking about how much of a disaster it was. Possibly one of Nvidia's worst ever graphics architectures, along with perhaps the FX series, the 5000 series. Definitely one of the worst GPU architectures of all time. Over at AnandTech, Nvidia's GeForce GTX 480 and GTX 470. 6 months late, was it worth the wait? The overwhelming consensus in the press being that no, it was not worth the wait. And that was by no means the end of the waiting, because it was June 2010 before Nvidia had their own version of Eyefinity, known as 3D Vision Surround. Not only was it later, you also required 2 Nvidia graphics cards in order to use the feature, whereas Eyefinity worked on 1 card. It should be clear by now that AMD had a large technology advantage at this time. Surely something that would be reflected with a commanding market share. Well, not quite. This is a rather old and low resolution slide, but you can see here the green line, which is Nvidia, and the red line, which is AMD. So this is the overall discrete graphics card market from the first quarter of 2010 to the first quarter of 2011. Now at the start of the year, Nvidia was up at almost 60%, but AMD had started to gain market share because they were so early with their DX11 cards in September 2009. It wasn't until the second quarter of 2010 when they finally took the lead by a tiny margin, just over 50% of the market, which they held until the third quarter of 2010, so around about this time, Nvidia's Fermi sales would be starting to kick in, and as you can see, AMD slipped a little bit down, but overall it remained about 50%. Now, I don't know about you, but given what you've just heard, do you believe that a 50% market share is a fair reflection of the technology here? Not only was AMD 6 months earlier, with the first DX11 cards, Nvidia had no real DX11 cards for 6 months. They had no competitor to Eyefinity for 9 months. They were massively behind in performance per watt. Basically speaking, they had nothing going for them apart from their mind share. And that mind share was good enough to hold on to half of the market share. This was a problem for me, and it was also a problem for AMD. Because if AMD has all of those advantages and yet can still barely only take the market share lead, what would happen when Nvidia finally made a comeback? Well, this is pretty much what happened. AMD had 1 or 2 mediocre series, Nvidia launched Kepler, and around the middle of 2012, Nvidia's market share started growing again. And since that point, it has just got worse and worse for AMD. To me, it became simple. Nvidia's mind share is so strong that nothing AMD does on the technology front would matter. When you've got odds stacked against you like that, you need to change the rules of the game. In AMD's case, it rarely rains, but it pours. And round about the same time that their graphics card market share started slipping, they also ran into problems with a 32nm process at GlobalFoundries. The first CPU on the process was meant to be Llano, and it was heavily delayed due to manufacturing issues at GlobalFoundries. And this isn't really like AMD, but they laid the blame squarely at GlobalFoundries for this. So their new process wasn't working very well. This is also the process that Bulldozer, the brand new CPU architecture, was going to be built on. And like I said, it rarely rains, but it pours. Bulldozer was a disaster. A catastrophe, in fact. Now, the big thing here is the graphics card market is not that big in money terms, and even Nvidia failed to make a lot of money for a lot of years. At one point, Nvidia went 5 years in a row basically just breaking even with the majority market share. There's just not a lot of money there. As I said, the CPU market has a lot of money in it. So long as AMD could be even close to Intel, they could be expected to make some decent money and stay afloat. But Bulldozer and the Llano disaster was so bad that people started to say, this is the end of AMD. They've got no chance. They are going to be wiped out in CPU, and even now they can't hold on to their graphics card share. What is a CPU and GPU company going to do in that situation? Well, luckily for them, their new CEO, Rory Reid, had an idea that would save the company. And that idea was called semi-custom. As said at the beginning of the video, AMD makes CPUs and GPUs, and obviously over the years they've collected a lot of intellectual property. So what Rory did was create a new semi-custom branch within the company, which allowed other companies to create their own semi-custom silicon at AMD, using AMD's intellectual property, for example, their Radeon graphics and their CPU cores. Just before we heard about semi-custom, there were rumours going around that AMD had won both of the major consoles, those being the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. Now in the past, both AMD and Nvidia generally had their GPU technology in one or the other consoles, but never at any time was either company in both, so this was entirely new. One of the main reasons AMD bought ATI back in 2006 is because they wanted to combine CPU and GPU into one, something that they labelled the APU, or Accelerated Processing Unit, and this is basically what is in the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. You have 8 CPU cores based on AMD's Jaguar architecture, which is very low power, pretty low performance CPU core, and the Radeon graphics, which in performance terms are pretty similar to an HD 7850, that's for the PlayStation 4, and probably an HD 7770 for the Xbox One. So obviously these rumours were true. AMD's semi-custom strategy launched with 2 major design wins in the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. One of the problems here though is there is an upper limit to how much a games console can cost. Therefore there is an upper limit to how much AMD can charge for this APU. And both of these APUs were rather large chips, which meant that margins were very low. And even though they were high volume, with many millions of units sold every year, each sale wasn't worth that much to AMD. It was, however, enough to keep them afloat. So let's take a look at the silicon in the consoles so we can understand the money behind this. Right, so here is a die shot of the PlayStation 4 APU. You can see here quad-core Jaguar x86 and another one. So basically these are 2 quad-core CPUs, and here you've got the 20 AMD Radeon graphics cores. This APU is 348mm squared. And now you've got the Xbox One APU. Once again, you can see the quad-core Jaguar x86. And again, this time you've only got 14 Radeon graphics cores. This is why the Xbox One is generally recognised as being less powerful, because it's got less graphics cores. And Microsoft also did a bizarre thing with memory, this SRAM here. I'm not going to go into it, but they made 1 or 2 curious decisions which has certainly affected their sales compared to the PlayStation. This is a slightly larger chip at 363mm squared. Now those sizes are very important because these are actually pretty large. Both of these chips were meant to be built at GlobalFoundries. However, GlobalFoundries was messing it up so badly that AMD had to pay to get them done at TSMC instead. Now as you know, TSMC also makes graphics chips for Nvidia and AMD. So if we compare both of these console APUs to what Nvidia was building at the time, we can see just how difficult these are to manufacture. This here is something like what the PlayStation 4 APU would look like on a wafer at TSMC. You would get around about 162 of them on a wafer. That's the maximum number. In actual fact, it would be much less because of yields. Maybe around 60% of these would be okay. The other 40% would be thrown away. Something like that. As you know, the Xbox One APU is slightly larger, so you get slightly less of them on the wafer. In this case, around about 154. The same rules apply. Maybe around 60% of them would be good, the rest would have to be thrown away. Now, around about this time, Nvidia was selling the GTX 680, GTX 670, with a die size of 294mm squared. As you can see, the smaller die size means you can get more onto the wafer. And not only that, yields would be higher because the chips that have errors on them may be salvageable as GTX 670s. The dies that had no defects on them would be GTX 680s, but some of those with defects can still be sold as GTX 670s. Now, the prices for these were around about $500 for the GTX 680 and something over $300 for the GTX 670. Nvidia probably getting more than half of that cost. So in other words, you're talking maybe $200, $250 for each of these GPUs and getting more of them on a wafer. With stuff like the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, AMD was only charging around $100 per APU, and they were getting much less of them on a wafer. And not only that, graphics chips like the GTX 680 maybe sell 1 million units per year. Something like the 670 maybe sells another 2-3 million. So overall, you're talking 4 million units for something that can be reasonably manufacturable. AMD was selling around 20 million of these larger APUs directly to Sony and Microsoft every year. In terms of manufacturability, the console chips are far harder to manufacture, require far more wafers, and are worth far less to AMD than what Nvidia's graphics chips were worth. And we saw this clearly. Nvidia didn't want the PlayStation 4. Now, some of this is an excuse, yeah? Of course, Nvidia wanted the PlayStation 4. And of course, they wanted to be in the Xbox One as well. However, what it really came down to was 2 things. A lack of the technology, but mostly Nvidia came to the conclusion that they didn't want to do business at the price those guys were willing to pay. In other words, AMD offered it cheaper. And Nvidia had to look at the console business as an opportunity cost. If they did a console, what other piece of their business would they have to put on hold to chase after that? Now, they do say it's clearly not a technology thing, but over at the Tech Report, they question that as well. there is more of a technology gap than they let on. AMD was able to give Sony some relatively powerful x86 CPU cores and a state-of-the-art GPU on a single chip. This is something that Nvidia can't really do. They do have Tegra, but they don't really have the kind of expertise that AMD has with APUs on this level. But make no mistake about it, even if they did have the technology, Nvidia would not have taken this chance, because simply put, the margins were not good enough and they could make more money elsewhere. AMD would have got the consoles no matter what. The thing about TSMC is, you've got companies like Apple, Qualcomm, Samsung, massive companies way bigger than both AMD and Nvidia, who also want these wafers for their smartphones, and they are willing to pay more than both AMD and Nvidia. So the graphics guys need to wait in line. Wait until the wafers get cheaper. They just don't have enough wafers for what they would really like to have, so choices do need to be made. Simply put, what is important here is the understanding that Nvidia cannot ever win the consoles again. They simply cannot afford to use their TSMC wafers on console chips. AMD can, and that knowledge is a very powerful thing, because if you control all of the consoles, that also puts you in control of game development. Providing the hardware is only one part of it though, that also requires a software ecosystem behind it. Right, I'm going to end it here. I'm currently more than halfway through the second part, so with a bit of luck, AMD's master plan will be revealed before the end of next week. As usual, there's a bunch of links in the description below, and a lively chat as well. I'll catch you later, guys.